About 2 months ago, we received a massive patch to Age of Empires 2. They completely reworked the infantry line, and they also introduced chickens to 50% of Arabia games in the 1v1 ladder. They also brought chickens to some other settings, but for the purpose of this video, we're going to be focusing mainly on the 1v1 Arabia side of things. And this patch really shook the meta and kind of brought some civs a little bit stronger, brought some other civs a little bit weaker. But with the case of the Gurjaras, something really interesting happened. Their win rate actually plummeted to the point where it's now one of the worst in the game. Gurjaras are currently sitting at a 43.2% win rate overall. Now you might be thinking, oh, that's just because it's a tricky civ to play, and it's most likely the lower elo players dropping the win rate down from a stable 49 or 50%. That sounds logical because the Gurjaras are a tricky civ to play, so it seems like it could be a low elo problem. However, that's not the case. At 1900 plus, which is pretty much the top 1% of players, the Gurjaras win rate is at a staggering 40.1%. This is dangerously close to getting into the 30% range, and that is abysmal. That is quite literally horrendous. This is one of the worst civs to ever exist when it comes to Age of Empires 2. So clearly, this is not a low elo issue. Gurjaras are performing horribly across all elos, and they seem to be at their absolute worst when it comes to the high elo games, surprisingly enough. And so, across the board, Gurjaras are at probably their lowest point in history. And just to put it in perspective, currently the 43.2% overall win rate for the Gurjaras is the third worst in the game, and the only two that are lower are the Jurchens and the Wei. To be fair though to the two newer civs, it's quite fair to have them being at the bottom of the barrel because they just got released as new civs with the most recent Three Kingdoms DLC, and so it's quite understandable that they're not balanced straight out the gate. There is some work that needs to be done, and both of these civilizations got a pretty significant buff on the last patch, the latest patch that dropped basically a few days ago, maybe a week or two since the video will be released. The funny thing though about this most recent patch is that while the Jurchens and Wei both got significant buffs, the Gurjaras got nothing. So it is probably safe to make the argument that the Gurjaras will be the worst 1v1 civilization in the game. And considering that the most played map by far on the 1v1 ladder is Arabia, it's pretty clear that the Gurjaras are, you can make the case at least, the worst 1v1 Arabia civ in the game currently after the most recent patch. Again, this is really surprising because historically Gurjaras have always hovered around the high 40s mark for win rates. A couple years ago when the Dynasties of India DLC was released and Gurjaras was a civilization in the game, it came out as a pretty strong civ. Then it got nerfed a little bit and kind of hovered around the 48 to 49.5% mark as far as overall win rate goes. And they were there for pretty much their entire existence. They were not seen as an overpowered civ, not seen as an underpowered civ. Everyone kind of agreed that it was a mid-range civ that had its own quirks and gimmicks. It was quite hard to play, a little bit more unique, but it was also quite difficult to play against. And so it was the kind of civilization you picked if you want to be more of an anti-meta player, or if you want to try something a little bit different, and you want to play with units that were a bit, out of the conventional knights and archers line. And the interesting thing about the Gurjaras win rate dropping is that they didn't receive a single direct nerf to the civ. So the win rate dropped drastically even though the civ was practically untouched. And so we have to wonder what happened to the Gurjaras that their win rate dropped to the third lowest in the game, and potentially after the most recent patch to the absolute lowest in the game. Well, let's go ahead and analyze. So let's start with the facts. So the win rate drop happened right after the big infantry patch, and right away I'm wondering if there's some kind of correlation there. And that's also the patch, if you remember, where chickens were introduced in 50% of Arabia games, which seems like a very substantial change, and it's definitely something that's worth noting. So far the two leads are infantry being changed and chickens being introduced. Remember, on this patch there were no direct changes to Gurjaras. The only thing that happened to the Gurjaras were that elephant archers got a slight price rework. Overall this was pretty minor and actually ends up being a total or overall slight buff, but even if you just call that change neutral, we can probably just ignore it and not consider it either for or against the Gurjaras. Now generally speaking, correlation doesn't always mean causation. So just because the Gurjaras win rate dropped right after this patch was released does not necessarily mean that the patch was responsible for this. But in this case, it's really hard to see any other reason for the Gurjaras win rate to suddenly drop, especially considering it was so consistent throughout their history, throughout the 2 years that they've been out as a civilization in the game. And since they themselves didn't receive any major changes in that same patch, we basically just have to investigate these two major changes that were introduced in that said patch, which is the chickens and the infantry changes. So to start off my investigation work, I went straight to these two causes, and here is what I found. Starting off with the meta arms and the infantry changes as a whole. Now, just to be quite frank, Gurjaras are not really an infantry civilization. Gurjaras cannot do meta arm opening that well, and that's because specifically you usually go for the mill first to get the eco bonus from the sheep. If you don't go for the mill first, you are playing a generic civ that gets 2 extra berry bushes under its town center, which really isn't that great. So as far as the Gurjaras going for their own men at arm rush, it's pretty much out of the question unless you forego your entire eco bonus, which is probably something that you can't afford doing in most cases. Moreover, Gurjaras can't really do much when it comes to infantry in the late game. All they get as far as the tech tree is two-handed swordsman and no champion. They also don't get gambesons, and they're missing blast furnace, the last attack upgrade from the blacksmith. So at best, they're getting a cheap two-handed swordsman that they're able to spam in the late game, but it's really nothing to brag about, and it's not their forte at all. If Gurjaras are doing infantry, it's going to be through their unique unit, the Chakram thrower, and not through the infantry line. And remember, for this patch, it was mainly the infantry line that saw the most amount of buffs and the most amount of changes. And Gurjaras can't utilize the infantry line early, so the men at arm buffs are kind of useless, and they can't really use the infantry line late because they don't have the best tech tree for it, and so their late game infantry is also kind of useless. So Gurjaras are not really benefiting from this infantry change at all, not early nor late. The second point here that's worth noting is that the Gurjaras are actually weak to men at arm pressure themselves. So not only can they not go for men at arms themselves, they're also weak to it, and this is because your mill is a sensitive target. Remember, the standard Gurjara start is to go for a mill right away before a lumber camp, and then you put all your sheep inside to get a slow trickle of food that pays off throughout the game. This comes as a bit of a sacrifice because that means that you can't eat the sheep that you put into the mill, so your start is a little bit slow and a little bit sluggish, and on top of that, your mill has to stay alive for you to get that trickle of food. If your mill dies, then you're completely out of an eco bonus and you have to run those sheep away before the opponent gets a hold of them. And as it so happens, a men at arm rush can actually take out a mill completely, and this is a very big weakness for the Gurjaras. Not only do you have to get off to some kind of an awkward start and you can't go for men at arms yourself to defend yourself early game, you also have to be up against stronger men at arms since they've been buffed, which can pressure your villagers on your wood line, on your berries. They can also pressure your villagers that are building stuff, and if all of that has been covered by your quick walls or by your army, they can just target your mill, essentially forcing you to fight the men at arms off immediately or to sit there idly repairing your mill to keep it alive. Now remember, even if they don't kill your mill, they're still going to force repairs from 1 or 2 villagers. This is 1 or 2 villagers that's going to be sapping your wood repairing a mill, and it's also not going to be working generating you more resources. So in the worst case scenario, you lose your mill and lose access to your sheep, and in the best case scenario, you're going to be sitting there with 1 villager trapped behind some palisade walls repairing the mill, which is not good for your early game economy. So no matter which way you twist it, Gurjaras will always be weak to early men at arm pressure. Now the last thing that's worth noting for infantry is that Gurjaras are not really weak to infantry in late game, so all buffs to champions and whatnot seem to me pretty irrelevant. Gurjaras don't benefit from them, but they also aren't hurt by it. They have hand cannoneer and their unique unit late game, which are completely good options to counter mass infantry, and I really just don't see infantry being a huge weakness for the Gurjaras in late game. They have solid hussars that can tank while their backline DPS can clear them out, and so Gurjaras might be slightly worse off since others have stronger champions as an option in late game now, sure, but I don't think this is a major point and contributing to their lower win rate. So now that we've dealt with infantry, it does seem like it's a pretty good reason for the Gurjaras to have a drop off since the infantry patch. All the changes don't really benefit them, and they actually hurt them quite a bit, and they also benefit all of the other civilizations instead of Gurjaras, and so comparing Gurjaras with all the other civs, we are now worse off. But now it's time to talk about the chickens, and here is where it really gets complicated. Now, when it comes to the chickens, it is worth mentioning that I have 2 excellent videos on the best ways to use chickens and how to incorporate them into your early game strategy on my Patreon. If you're confused about chickens at all in your games, definitely recommend you guys check that out in the link in the description below. But back to Gurjaras. Gurjaras are not good with the chickens. They clearly don't have access to my Patreon, but actually, even if the Gurjaras did, it still wouldn't help out. You see, most Gurjara players want to make a mill instantly on berries just to throw the sheep inside and get that food trickling in from the start of the game. This is completely natural, and that's what I've been doing with the Gurjaras ever since they've been released. And if you do this, remember, you're making the mill before the lumber camp, and it's really hard to slap down the first mill, throw the sheep in for the eco bonus, then you have to get on the stragglers to get wood in for your lumber camp, and then after your lumber camp, only then would you be able to go for that second mill to take advantage of the chickens. This is incredibly difficult to do and pretty much not really a possible strategy before Fuel Lich kicks in. If you had this crazy idea of making a second mill on the chickens before making a lumber camp, you'd also probably be exactly that, crazy, because then you'd be taking the straggler trees for far too long, which would be incredibly inefficient, and it just wouldn't be worth it at all. It'd also make you later to feudal age and later to actually get your military out on the field. And so Gurjaras are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. You either go for your eco bonus and slap down your mill on your berries, or you completely forego that and you have to scout if it's a chickens Arabia and then throw your mill on the chickens. If you do that, your mill is going to be late, so you're going to miss out on some at least 2 or 3 minutes on your sheep trickling the food. And in some cases it won't even be chickens Arabia, so you'd have to scout for it, see that it's not chickens Arabia, and then you have to throw your mill on the berries a bit later, and so you also miss out on 2 to 3, maybe even more minutes of that food trickling in. And the sheep being outside the mill early are not really helping you that much. Like, you can eat 2-3 of them and be a generic civ to start the game, but the other 4 just sitting there are not helping you at all. So you're kind of just wasting your eco bonus and you're playing a generic civ. And remember, playing a generic civ when your opponent likely has some kind of eco bonus or some kind of military bonus will usually just mean that you're on the back foot from the start of the game, which is a losing strategy for the most part. Another problem with Chicken Arabia is that you actually might have to eat some of your sheep in Dark Age. Remember, you run out of your boars pretty quickly without the deer and chicken. If it's Deer Arabia, it's no problem, you just lure in the deer and it's completely fine. When it's Chicken Arabia, you can't lure in the chicken, and so you're kind of just stuck. You can't mill the chicken, as we've already discussed, and you can't lure it to your town center because that's the chicken mechanic, so you're kind of just stuck without deer and also without chicken. This makes it so your early game food is very limited, and it also reduces your eco bonus, since if you grab some sheep out of the mill, you're going to be lowering the overall trickle of food that you're getting. Now, it is worth noting that Gurjaras can go down to 4 sheep in the mill, and they're still relatively okay. Remember, it's not a linear relationship that the more sheep you put in, the more you get in a 1-to-1 ratio. It's something like the first 4 sheep are really efficient to put into the mill, and then any sheep after that really has a harsh drop off as to the amount of food that it trickles per minute. And so you can make the argument that you only need 4 sheep in the mill with a standard Gurjaras game to get the most out of your eco bonus, but even still, being forced to eat some of your sheep in Dark Age just because you can't afford to take the chickens will set you behind your opponent who's just playing a more standard civ. So even in the best case scenario, considering all of the little quirks about the civ, Gurjaras are at best getting a small disadvantage compared to the average civ, and they still probably can't take advantage of the chicken in the early game. And here is the worst part. As I mentioned earlier, you don't know it's Chicken Arabia right away until you scout. So waiting until you confirm before making a mill is at best an inconsistent approach to your Dark Age. Sometimes it's going to work out and you're going to be able to mill your chicken, throw your sheep in pretty quickly, and you'll be pretty happy about it. But the other times where it's a Deer Arabia, you're going to be wasting 2-3 minutes, and then you're going to make a mill on berries afterwards, and you're going to be losing like 3 to 4 minutes of food trickling time since you didn't make the mill right away. So after doing all of this analysis, for me, it's very clear why Gurjaras had such a sharp drop-off of win rate, from something like 48 to 49%, all the way down to 43% overall, and 40% when you consider the highest level of 1900 plus Arabia games. We can see that this is a massive drop-off when it comes to civ win rate. However, the reason for this massive drop-off has never been clear to me at this point. The chickens are so unfavorable for the Gurjaras, and all of the infantry changes favors every other civilization and not the Gurjaras. It makes it harder to play the Gurjaras because you're going to be up against stronger infantry more consistently, and you yourself cannot take advantage of the infantry changes for your benefit, nor can you take advantage of the chickens on 50% of your Arabia games. After weighing these two reasons together, I came to the personal conclusion that the chickens Arabia is a bigger nerf to Gurjaras than the men-at-arms meta is. It makes 50% of your games extremely difficult from the start, and you just get off to a weaker and slower start compared to every other civ in the game. Yes, the men-at-arms meta does hurt Gurjaras, but it's not nearly the same amount of damage that the chicken Arabia is doing. Now, all these problems sound quite daunting, and while it looks grim for the Gurjaras and we could just sit around and wait for a patch to come through and save the Gurjaras and bring them back towards the light, I came up with a couple practical solutions that I've just thought of that I'm going to implement into my own game right away. The first one is that the best case scenario that we have is to simply delay the mill. Delay the mill and just eat your first 4 sheep normally with the Gurjaras. Accept the loss of a bit of eco bonus and get a more consistent early game. You only need the 4 sheep in the mill to get a good chunk of your eco bonus anyways, like I mentioned earlier, so we're pretty much okay to do this. Make your first mill on chickens now that you have extra time to scout, and if it's Deer Arabia, no problem, we just lumber camp first like any generic civ, and then we make the mill on berries eventually, and just stick the 4 remaining sheep in there. If you have any extra sheep, of course, you can just stick them into the mill. Why not? There's no point of keeping 1 or 2 sheep lying around. In this case, we just have a consistent start that takes advantage of our eco bonus to a decent degree. Yes, it's not ideal, but at least we can get some consistency back in our lives and not have to gamble on 50% of our games. And the second point with the Gurjaras is to always open archers versus men-at-arms and actively prepare every game as if your opponent is going for them, so you can consistently protect your mill against the threat of early game infantry. You should do this especially if your opponent is on a men-at-arms civ, or if you have any suspicion if your opponent is going men-at-arms or not, or you can just have it as a rule to always open archers. It's not a bad opening, and it's quite reasonable to do as a Gurjara player anyways, since you usually get up to feudal age pretty quickly. So if you just always open archers, you're going to be safe against infantry for the most part. And I promise I didn't make this video just to plug Patreon, but I actually have an insane video on Patreon about how to never die to men-at-arm rush, and yes, it usually involves opening archers. Trust me, that video helps a lot, and it's exactly the same tips that I use in my own games to not die to men-at-arm rushes with generic civs, and it's what I'm going to be using from now on as the Gurjaras to protect myself against the men-at-arms. Remember, this video is also eye-opening to me. So in conclusion, it's clear that the Gurjaras are definitely worse off now. That's a fact. But I think the approach I came up with in the end can definitely help us stabilize with them and give us a good winning chance despite the odds being against us. I will be using these tricks myself going forward because as it happens, I've personally been struggling to win with the Gurjaras lately as well. I'm also a victim of the lower win rate, especially at 1900 plus where it's at 40%, so I'm definitely feeling the pressure and suffering from their lack of early game options. So that's all I have for you today, folks. Let me know if you guys enjoyed the video and this nice discussion around the Gurjaras win rate. Let me know if you yourselves have run into any problems with this civilization, or if you've noticed that the win rate has dropped drastically since the infantry patch, and let me know your thoughts on my 2 suggestions on how to play the Gurjaras going forward to survive in the current meta. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to comment, like, subscribe if you guys did enjoy. And if you guys want to see more from me, you can check out my live stream on twitch.tv/Hera, link in the description below, along with the Patreon, which I've already mentioned several times. And as always, hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.